Hello everyone, my name is Madison Leeson and welcome to the first lecture of the course Cultural Governance in the Modern Middle East. I will first offer a brief introduction to the course before getting into our lecture content for week one. So this course offers a general introduction to the modern history of heritage management in the Middle East, focusing on the 19th and 20th centuries. This is generally what's meant by modern, although some scholars consider it even from the 18th century. Material in our course will explore how heritage and culture have been leveraged for political legitimacy by various individuals, institutions, and governments, both in the Middle East and abroad. For those that are abroad, namely the UK and the US, these negotiations for political legitimacy have focused on the Middle East or centered around Middle Eastern cultural heritage. We will also consider local claims to authority that competed with the central government in Europe and in the United States as well as in the Middle East, and the implications for heritage management in a broader context of development. I'll get into this a little bit more later in this lecture for week one. The case studies that we'll look at in our course are used as vehicles to explore broader theoretical concepts such as colonialism, identity, nationalism, and decolonization. This is a recurring theme, particularly because material culture and cultural heritage are often really closely tied to identity development, colonialism, the expression of power, and as a result, when you study the ways heritage has been managed, this often provides you a window into other larger power struggles and moments of human activity. So there are four main learning objectives for our course. First, I'm hoping that everyone by the end of this course will be able to articulate some major ways that heritage has been appropriated for political aims. So in other words, ways that people, institutions, or governments have leveraged or exploited heritage to accomplish a political agenda. I also hope that you will be able to summarize some broad themes in cultural governance, and I'll get into the definition of that shortly, what cultural governance means and how it's different than heritage management. I hope that you will understand the challenges for heritage managers in regions of conflict. This is something that we will get into in week 5 of the course, specifically looking at looted antiquities and the destruction of heritage in times of armed conflict. And finally, reflect on the decolonization of heritage management scholarship. As I mentioned on the previous slide, heritage is really closely tied to identity. And the field of heritage management has been one avenue, one channel for imperial powers, particularly in the West, to exert some form of control or superiority over actors in what's often called the third world or the developing world, the non-West. And so I hope that by the end of this course, you'll be able to appreciate these sort of inadvertent colonialisms, and we can work together to think about how we can decolonize the field going forward. So there is only one assignment for this course. You will be required to submit a 1,000-word response by the end of the course. You'll actually have an extra 2 weeks after the end of the course so you can digest all the material. You should address one of the readings from the course, from any week, it's up to you, and offer a brief summary of the author's argument, what are they saying, and then expand on their text through either your critique of their argument or further analysis. Maybe you want to apply their logic to a different case study, or you found some interesting resource that you think complements theirs well. It's very open-ended. Further assignment guidelines will be available on Google Classroom. Optionally, you can participate in live and virtual discussions through Google Classroom. These won't be graded and they're not required for you to pass the course, but it will, of course, improve your engagement and retention and allow you to discuss with your colleagues and myself the topics that we're talking about in class. Maybe you want to expand on one of the readings, you thought something was very interesting, and you want to know others' feedback. I would really suggest it. All of our course materials will be posted in PDF to the Google Classroom and revealed week by week as we move through the course. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to email me. You can find my email on Google Classroom, and I will also put it at the end of this presentation. So this is week 1. This is our first lecture, Heritage Management in the Ottoman Middle East. We will begin by looking at the Middle East in the Ottoman period to consider the emergence of the first antiquities protection legislation. Many of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa belonged to the Ottoman Empire, which reached its height in the late 17th century, before declining and gradually losing territory, first in the Balkans and then in North Africa. Finally, we see the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in 1922 and the emergence of the modern state of Turkey. And so many of the countries in the Middle East that we will talk about in this course were once in the Ottoman Empire, and because of this, their antiquities protection legislation today grew out of what existed in the Ottoman Empire. And so that's why we're going to start by looking at the late Ottoman period. We will consider the notion of Ottoman indifference towards archaeology and heritage and discuss the historical foundations of this argument. I will get to it just in a second, but this is another one of those terms that is really important for appreciating the full cultural governance and in the Middle East, and one of the ways that the West has interfered for political gain. The assigned reading for this week offers an overview of early heritage management efforts, key figures in Ottoman heritage management, and the origins of the Imperial Archaeology Museum in Constantinople. Constantinople was the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and before that, the Byzantine Empire. It's today Istanbul. So this is the Ottoman Empire at its peak in the late 17th century. This is a really good map because you can see the acquisitions of the empire under each sultan, sort of culminating with Suleiman the Magnificent, who conquered Constantinople from the Byzantine Empire and expanded the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire to its greatest point. Now, one thing that's really interesting to note at this point is that you can see the empire is massive. It covers 3 continents, with the capital in Edirne at the time. It was later moved to Constantinople. And key figures such as Osman Hamdi Bey, who was addressed in our reading for this week and who I will talk about in a moment. He was the founder of the Imperial Archaeology Museum in Constantinople. And this museum was meant as a response to European encroachment in the Ottoman Empire. European individuals, institutions like the British Museum, and governments would often go into the Ottoman Empire, often informally, sort of traveling without explicitly saying that they were there for antiquities. But they would travel through the Ottoman Empire and collect antiquities through what couldn't really be called excavations because they weren't as systematic as excavations today. But they traveled through particularly the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, which is Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and North Africa, and collect antiquities, which were then brought back to Europe. And so Osman Hamdi Bey founded the Imperial Archaeology Museum in Constantinople as a response to this, which paralleled the development of antiquities protection legislation in the Ottoman Empire, which I have in a few slides. And under him, the Ottoman Empire began to go into the Arab provinces and collect antiquities, which were then shipped back to Constantinople. So here we have imperial European encroachment, which was then sort of replaced by imperial encroachment of the capital, of Constantinople. They began to do the same things that the European powers were doing in the Arab provinces, which is where you find most of the sort of famous antiquities. Iraq obviously is called the cradle of civilizations. Ancient Mesopotamia has a lot of archaeology and cultural heritage there, and these were sort of sources for the Ottoman Imperial Archaeology Museum. So this is Osman Hamdi Bey. He was a painter himself and a bureaucrat, and founder of the Imperial Archaeology Museum, which is today the Istanbul Archaeology Museums. Our reading for this week is by Edhem Eldem. The title is From Blissful Indifference to Anguished Concern, Ottoman Perceptions of Antiquities from 1799 to 1869. So there's these terms that are really important to clarify from the outset: blissful indifference and Ottoman indifference. When heritage management scholarship was kind of in its early days, most of the scholars were Americans and Europeans, and they needed to explain somehow the difference between antiquities protection in the West, antiquities in the West at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, were considered national treasures, and the average person had felt a very close affinity to this material culture. In contrast, these European and American scholars viewed something close to indifference from the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East. They felt that the average person in the Ottoman Empire or Middle East, and even their governments, didn't care about archaeology or cultural heritage, and that it was thus Europe's responsibility to care for these antiquities and sculptures, so to bring them from the Ottoman Empire to Europe to take care of them. And they justified this by saying if we didn't remove these things from the Ottoman Empire, they would have just deteriorated, not been cared for, remained dormant in the sand due to Ottoman indifference. And this is still an argument that's used today for why the British Museum, for example, or the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, for why they continue to hold on to these objects. They say that we rescued these objects from Ottoman indifference. And even today, the indifference of modern states, such as Iraq or Syria, who may not have the resources, the same resources as the West to care for these objects. So it's really important that we know these terms going forward and how they've been used by the West to hold on to these objects. So in his text, Eldem contends that too much of Ottoman historiography actually has focused on Osman Hamdi Bey and the Imperial Museum, when more should be written on the century before, in which the Ottoman Empire saw foreign archaeologists and diplomats removing more and more artifacts to be shipped to Europe and the United States. And so this little bit of context that I've given you, Eldem actually argues that this period has been written about too much, and what we need to do is focus more on what came before. So we know the Ottoman Empire began implementing antiquities protection legislation, but why? What was this a response to? What did they hope to achieve? So this is very famous sculptures in the British Museum. They're often called the Parthenon marbles, and sometimes, unfortunately, the Elgin marbles. For those who don't know the story, these were originally on the Acropolis in Athens, on the Parthenon, and until they were removed in the early 19th century by Thomas Bruce, Lord of Elgin. He, against the wishes of the locals, and Greece was at the time under the Ottoman Empire, against their wishes, he sort of violently removed them from the Acropolis. From the Parthenon, they were scraped on the back, just kind of chiseled off the frieze of the Parthenon, crated up and shipped back to London, and where they now still are in the British Museum. And Lord Elgin argued that he had permission from the Ottoman government to take them. And this is a really hot topic in heritage management and antiquities protection today, is the hopefully the eventual return of these Parthenon marbles to the Parthenon, or at least to the Acropolis Museum in Athens. A lot of what are called restitutionists, which are people who want cultural heritage to return to its source country. A lot of them are saying that Lord Elgin didn't have permission to remove the sculptures, and even if he did, the majority of people today in both Greece and England, the majority of people want them to be returned to Greece, where they can be reunited with the other sculptures and structures on the Acropolis, because it's in this context that they would best be appreciated. For instance, in this picture, you can see that the sculptures are displayed at eye level, which is not how they were originally meant to be viewed. They were meant to be viewed from below, looking up, because they would be on the frieze of the Parthenon, which is a very tall building. Also, several crates of the sculptures, when they were being shipped to London, one of the ships sank in the Mediterranean, and it sat at the bottom of the Mediterranean for about 2 years before the sculptures were rescued and then brought, reunited with the others in London. This obviously caused a lot of damage. Then when they arrived in London, they were exposed to even more damage, the pollution of the city of London, and also they were scrubbed with steel wool by staff of the British Museum, which removed any traces of the ancient paint that remained. And so now we have no way of reconstructing the colors of what these statues originally looked like. So a lot of bad has come from this removal, which a lot of people call illicit. And so we'll see. This is an interesting topic to know about in heritage management, and we will see what happens if they eventually get to be returned to Greece. So Eldem focuses on mostly 19th century antiquities protection legislation and the European encroachment that motivated it. He pays attention to the case study of Elgin's removal of the Parthenon marbles, using Ottoman archives and records to present the episode from the Ottoman perspective. So Elgin later produced a firman, which is an imperial order, like permission from the Ottoman government that he was able to remove the sculptures. However, the firman, something has happened to it now. We no longer have it. And there's no copy in the Ottoman archives. The Ottoman Empire kept very meticulous archives really excellent archives. They actually have over 150 million documents in the archives today, and dating back centuries and centuries. And the odds that they would somehow misplace this really important firman is kind of unlikely. And so analysis must be done to determine whether Elgin's firman was authentic or not, whether he had permission to remove them. This is the Ottoman State Archive. It's in Istanbul, and it's a really excellent resource, especially if you're Turkish, because then you're able to purchase archival documentation online. If you're not Turkish, you can still make an account and access it online, but you will need a Turkish friend to purchase it for you. If anyone is interested in using documents from the Ottoman State Archive, maybe in their response assignment for this class, or for other research you'd like to do, please reach out to me. Archival research is something I'm really passionate about. It's what most of my research is based on, and I would be really excited to help you access these archives so you can do this kind of research as well. The first formal legislation in the Ottoman Empire was in February 1869 and established that excavators need permission from the state in order to excavate, which meant foreign institutions like archaeology departments of British and American universities, they needed explicit permission now. They can't just come in, excavate, and take things. And the 1869 bylaw also prohibited export, so you needed explicit permission for this as well. An 1874 decree established state ownership of all artifacts, which is very common. And we've seen similar decrees from post-Ottoman states as well, just establishing state ownership of all artifacts and then requiring explicit permission to excavate or collect or export them. And then in 1884, we have another decree which prohibits the sale or transfer of antiquities within the empire. However, half of the value of artifacts could be given to the landowner, so whoever owns the property on which the artifact was found, at the state's discretion. So we have these three pieces of legislation which gradually establish greater state control over the artifacts and prohibit their private ownership. So that is it for today for Lecture 1. For next week, please read Selim Diringo's article, which is available on Google Classroom. And feel free to share your thoughts on Google Classroom in our discussion. You can email me if you found anything interesting or confusing. Yeah, I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to seeing you next week.